All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of Finance and Corporate Services Committee. We have two items on the agenda, and I understand Mr. Wakeland is going to take us through for the first item on asset management. Mr. Wakeland, when you're ready. I'll cue you in here 1 second. There you go.
All right. Let me. So this meeting today, it's our discussion about the non-core asset management plans. Let me get into it here. Basically, there's two recommendations in the report. Both are related to compliance. So basically with this, we have to complete non-core asset management plans and have them approved by council, and also a regular update of our asset management policy that also has to be approved. All right, so in the policy, it's been a while since it's been updated. 5 years. So we've updated a lot of the terminology, some of the actions from the strategic plan. They've been updated. Also, how we set up the organization. You'll see in the next slide how we've laid that out. Basically, it complies with the Ontario regulation related to infrastructure asset management. We've taken things out. Guiding principles are in there now. Objectives have been updated. Roles and responsibilities are updated. So over time, as we do this, the policies that the city has to be reflected through our asset management plan, and we use those to help guide what we do. This is just showing part of the strategic asset management plan. So one part we refreshed was the roles and responsibilities. So this shows the different groups that are involved, and I think the key part of this is it's basically including everyone, all the groups at the city, from council down to working groups and subject matter experts in each different asset management type. And it's an up and down, like basically council will give us policies, set up things like climate change, core cap, that can come down and are reflected in our asset management plans. And things that we work on, we may require input from higher levels up the chain to make sure we're doing the right thing. So it goes up and down, and our asset management section is kind of coordinating and making sure it all works out. So this is just showing parts of the OREG. It's OREG 58817. If you're in asset management, that's burned in your brain. But basically within that, there's different components. So the strategic asset management policy, which we've created and updated. The core plans, there's core and non-core. So we've created core. The non-core is what we need. We've completed those and basically need them okayed by council, and that's what we're trying to show today. And the next step of this will be in July 2025, where we'll be looking at the proposed levels of service. So this one talks about current levels of service, and then the next one will talk about proposed based on funding and different aspects like that. This just shows something I just mentioned earlier, that there's core and non-core, and they're all core to us, I guess, in a way. But the regulation has divided it out so that the core assets were completed earlier and to get the asset management plans going, and we've been focusing mainly on the non-core, and these are the ones that have to be completed and are included with the report. All right, so the AMPs, which are the asset management plans, they include current levels of service, the performance of assets, basically what assets do we have and what do we know about them. So, and then finally, the life cycle activities we need to maintain them. All right, so this is getting into some of the details of the actual plans. So there are individual plans for each asset, non-core asset type, but this image here shows that we have about $2.4 billion in non-core assets, and the things that we know about them. So regarding condition, Nearly half of them are in good to very good condition. About 20% are in fair condition, and about 30% are in poor to very poor condition. Now, assets with a condition rating of fair or better are likely functioning well and require regular minimum maintenance, but assets with a condition rating of poor or worse likely require more significant maintenance or are in need of replacement. So this diagram that we have here shows that facilities as part of the non-core are by far the largest asset type, with a total current replacement value of $1.9 billion. So basically, increased funding for facilities has been a focus through recent budgets. And I've only been here for a year, but I know in talking to Ryan that council may recall previous decisions to allocate ongoing funds to facilities infrastructure program reserve, as well as a one-time funding increase of $5 million to facilities as part of the 2024 budget. And since identifying facilities as a major infrastructure need about 5 years ago, the city's increased funding to facilities from about $50 million over 10 years to about $120 over 10 years. So it's important to note that we're not going to solve all of our infrastructure funding needs in one fell swoop, but continued incremental changes will help us move in the right direction. One example of this is the next report on the agenda that seeks approval to transfer funding from our tax stabilization reserve to the tax capital reserve in an effort to make more funding available for asset renewal. All right, so this one is just highlights from the non-core AMPs. Basically, we have about $2.4 billion of non-core assets, most of which are facilities. Creating the AMPs, which is part of the OREG, but it's helping us as a city gather valuable information and develop our asset management skill sets. It's also identified some data gaps, which we plan to close with better processes. So we will need more funding, they've shown, to maintain our assets. This should include methods under the city's control, like the change to the reserves policy I've already mentioned. And funding for the infrastructure is the top advocate priority for FCM, who have asked the federal government to invest at least $500 million annually in municipal community, culture, and recreational infrastructure for the next 10 years. All right, so this slide is talking about non-core AMPs and the next steps that we have. So basically through these AMPs, it's helped us look at, and the AMPs basically talk about the processes we already do at the city, but helps us to coordinate and focus on different things we can do to make the asset management process better through the city. So through this, we've seen that it's better to work smarter and not harder. So preventative maintenance is a big component, and this diagram is showing that it's much cheaper to spend money early to do preventative maintenance than it is to redo assets when they fail. So we can extend the life of assets, and we do a lot of this already, but we're always investigating other ways to increase planned maintenance versus reactive maintenance. So the other things we need to do, identify resources needed to properly plan and identify projects. So that includes people and funding. So basically we're trying to figure out when the best point in time to complete different components of the asset management life cycle to reduce the likelihood of maintenance, reactive maintenance that costs more. And finally, this is something that's been a big focus of our group, is develop better asset management strategies. So there's lots of different things that can impact how we do asset management and how that is optimized to get the best bang for your buck. So part of that is looking at assets, especially on the facility side, through acquisition and disposal strategies. So we try to maintain assets the best we can, but also we want to try to acquire or get set policies that when we acquire assets, they're in the best shape that we can get them in. And if they're in a point where it's going to cost a lot to fix them, looking at disposal strategies for that. We also talk about optimized maintenance programs. So that's related to when we do treatments and trying to do more planned maintenance and minor maintenance instead of doing full maintenance at the end. And I think the one thing that's a big part of the non-core AMPs is risk-based level of service targets. So it's important for us to focus our energies and costs. There are lots of things that need to be replaced or work that needs to be done, but we like to focus on high risk. So it's either high risk to completing the proper services for the people in the city, or high risk related to safety, technical, capabilities, things like that, that keep the level of service up so things run well. So that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wickland. Questions? First, Councillor Ioannidis.
Thanks, Chair Davey, and thanks for the presentation. It's always fun to talk about asset management. I guess my one question, and just wanted to know exactly where this falls under, and one of the things that we probably hear a lot about as members of council is our sidewalk conditions. So what category is this, does our sidewalks fall in here? Is it under the roads or?
It's under transportation.
Transportation?
Yeah.
Okay. And do you have any specifics that you could add, that highlight about how we're managing our sidewalk program?
Yeah, the sidewalk program, a component of the asset management team that we work with is there's sidewalk inspections that we do annually. So part of that, so we're talking about OREG, but there's also minimum maintenance standards that the city has to follow. And so certain trip hazards we have to acknowledge and fix within a certain time limit. So we have a plan every year that we go out, we inspect all the sidewalks, we mark where the issues are, and then those go to operations that go out and fix those. So, and as a large part of that, we also go to different court cases and talk about the process that we have and how we do that. So it's basically through inspection, and we go out and mark that and get operations to fix those.
Okay, I guess my other question with regards to is I feel like I've seen somewhat of an improvement with our sidewalks, but I still feel like there's a lot to go. So are we looking at increasing a number of kilometers per year or anything like that, like the way we do with our roads?
I'll look to Mr. Haggie to respond, but just in the interest of the general purpose of the report is asset management overall, not specific replacement programs in any one area, because that could spin out of control in terms of discussion. But Mr. Haggie?
Sure. And forgive my voice. For those of you that know me, know I normally don't talk like this. So if we're looking to, increase budgets for sidewalks, that's something we'd have to do through the budget process. As Mr. Wakeland had mentioned, we're looking at areas of risk. And so as we see things becoming more risky, those are areas that we would consider adding funding to through budget processes.
Okay. Great voice.
Thanks.
And Councillor Johnson queued out. There's no one else in the queue. Just a couple of questions, if I could. Just in the governance role that we have, and I try not to preface my questions, but I think I need to here. I guess sort of the way that I sense that most municipalities are operating is they realize that the infrastructure deficit that we have is unmanageable under current funding models with the province and the federal government, and they're sort of operating as if it will be resolved at some point in the future. So I guess in trying to decide how to handle this information going forward, are there simpler to understand metrics that we can be looking at in the future, for example, our infrastructure debt per capita, and compare it to other municipalities to see if we're actually improving comparatively, or because that's the picture that would really help me understand this better. Sorry. Oh,
Sorry, I had turned my mic off.
There you go.
Yeah, so we have the core information about core assets. We've had that for a couple of years, so we're able to track ourselves versus others now, and figure out what our trends are over the next few years. Now that we have non-core assets, we'll be able to do something similar and be able to measure ourselves against ourselves over time, but also against other municipalities. As Mr. Wakeland mentioned, advocacy at the FCM level it's a hugely important thing. I know our mayor regularly talks to other levels of government about funding for infrastructure. It is something that we cannot tackle just on our own. And so anytime we can get that message out and back it up with data, it's a good opportunity for us to make that case.
Okay, thank you. There are no further questions. Could I get a mover for the item? Mayor Verbanovich, did you want to move it as well? Okay, go
Some
ahead.
comments. Yeah, just, I mean, first of all, just want to thank staff for the report that's in front of us. It's an incredibly important piece of work, both so that this council and future councils have a solid understanding of what the assets are that we have as a city, and also the investments that are required to keep those assets up while we continue to also invest in new facilities for a growing community. I think, you know, it'd be remiss if I didn't use this as an opportunity to reinforce something that that was raised in the presentation, and that's, you know, specifically the challenges that cities like Kitchener and communities of all sizes are dealing with across the country. And that's the reality that we are tackling the issues, both operating issues and capital issues, in the 21st centuries with a policy and a fiscal framework that exists from the 19th century. And quite frankly, we've always been able to, you know, piece things together to make that work for a long time. But it's not sustainable, and it's why, you know, both through AMO and through FCM, we've been saying, you know, the time for a new fiscal framework was yesterday, but because, you know, there was no willingness in having those conversations, certainly the time is now, because it's imperative in terms of, you know, our collective plans going forward. We I think have certainly made significant, you know, progress along the way, but clearly, you know, with things like in construction inflation and other impacts, that continues to be a challenge. I mean, I think back to when we did the original infrastructure deficit report at FCM. I think the numbers, if I remember correctly, was a 120 billion deficit, and then another 215 or something that was future-related infrastructure in cities. And while we certainly made some progress, and, you know, I think we need to acknowledge from successive federal governments the investments in things like what used to be called the gas tax and that program and others, we've been able to make some inroads, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And you know, this plan and this framework certainly provides the foundation that gives us the information that we need, and also helps us tell the story to the provincial and federal governments as we tackle that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ioannidis.
Is it okay if I talk? Okay. Anyways, this is more for the mayor, because I know there was this statistic that was used a lot back in the day, that for every dollar the tax collected for infrastructure, municipalities got like 8 cents. Where are we now at that? Are we at 9, 10 cents?
Sorry, Mayor Rabinovich.
Good question, Councillor Ioannidis. The figure was, and it obviously varied province to province and territory to territory, but it was roughly 9 cents of every tax dollar collected went to local governments. And, you know, I think at certain points in time that maybe it's gone up to 10, but the point being, I think that example that you just gave speaks to the reason why a new fiscal framework is needed. And that's not going to come easy, because it obviously means that in order for us to have more, and if you recognize that, you know, people are tapped out, it means that more transfers need to happen from fiscal and federal provincial and federal frameworks rather. And so that's going to be a challenging but gradual road that needs to be embarked on, I think, by municipalities and our federal and provincial and territorial partners in order to achieve that.
Okay, anyways, well, I'm hoping for 12 cents.
Councillor Singh?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and my apologies to staff that I wasn't here for the presentation, but I did thoroughly look through the report, and it's a very sobering report. I think if I'm out of ideas as to what to wear for Halloween, just print out the replacement value chart, and I think that should be scary enough to a lot of Kitchener residents. And with that, I appreciate everything that Mayor Vivanovic has said, and I think I agree with him as well. But I think we have to be very cognizant of the actual reality of the financial circumstances nationally as well. I mean, and provincially, the province is running deficits, the feds are running deficits. There's not a lot of money around. And the fact that we have deficits in our infrastructure for replacement, as the numbers that we're seeing, it means that we need to, as much as we look outward to the other orders of government, we need to look inward as well, which is we need to extend the life of these buildings. We can't necessarily replace them. We got to have these buildings longer. And at the same time, as we look to build more, we have to realistically consider what would the future replacement value of those buildings be as well, so that not only are we just budgeting the construction, but also budgeting the future replacement. That is why we are in a difficult circumstance, because we built it, but we didn't necessarily adequately budget to replace it as well. And I think when the life of these facilities sometimes tend to be 50 years or beyond, I think it's possible to do for us to be a little bit more realistic. Just wanted to bring some sober thought to it.
Councillor Ennis, you had follow-up?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Davey. And there's no doubt that there's challenges with our infrastructure, not only through Kitchener and it's throughout Canada. I guess my only concern is I feel on our end that we've been doing a really good job with our asset management, and I feel that we're getting the short end of the stick when it comes to municipalities like Toronto, who are crying for infrastructure funds and then gets them. And so it's a balance that we need to figure out and how we move forward.
Yeah, I would agree with the mayor's comments, and definitely to some extent with Councillor Singh in terms of if you have an asset problem, one of the ways to deal with that is to make sure that any new assets, you make sure you really, really need that new asset, because that just gets added onto the burden. And I think we'll probably be entering a quiet period after the construction we're seeing in the southwest of Kitchener. I'm fully expecting that there's a quiet period in terms of consolidating and upgrading our existing infrastructure versus building new. Having said that, though, I do fear that the magnitude of this is hidden behind the scenes. It's not a debt or a deficit that people see day to day. They go to their community center and they engage in their program, and they don't know what the plumbing's like behind the scenes. So it's something we need to make sure that we stay on top of. And to our credit, I think that we are, and the following report we're about to deal with begins to address that growing gap as well. So anyway, it's been moved by Mayor Vrbanovic. Those in favor? And opposed? Oh, none opposed. Very good. Okay, next item, which we've alluded to. The reserve fund policy. And Ms. Fisher, you're handling this for us? Yeah. You can just cue in there, or... Oh, there you go. Ms. Fisher, when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Davey and members of committee. In the theme of policies, we have presenting to you today our proposed changes to our reserve fund policy and related updates. So the current reserve fund policy was approved in 2012 and was reviewed in 2016. It was scheduled for an additional review then in 2020, but as we know, not everything went according to plan that year. So the policy review in front of you today is really just a scheduled review that we do as part of our best practices. It supports the action items identified from the long-term financial plan that was approved in 2019, including identifying roles and responsibilities within the policy, reviewing funding levels and targets, and generally supporting the transparency surrounding the city's finances. The review is really just recalibrating a few pieces within the existing reserve fund framework, and minimal changes are proposed. The city's reserve funds are reasonable and continue to align with the best practices as identified by the GFOA, which is the Government Finance Officers Association, and other comparator municipalities. Most of the changes proposed, as I mentioned, are administrative and minor in nature. There's just 2 changes that we're proposing to balance some risks that we're seeing in the city's finances and operations. With the exception of the COVID-19 pandemic, the city has been fortunate to have modest operating surpluses in the range of about 1% of budget, which shows efficient and effective budget control. So we're proposing to recalibrate within the existing framework to help balance some risks using those modest surpluses. The first risk is around our capital deficit, as seen in the asset management report and the presentation done by Brad. So that's how these kind of 2 reports tie together, as he alluded to. This review of the reserve fund policy is one way to begin mitigating the financial risk seen in our asset management plan. It's not meant to solve it, as we kind of discussed, but it's just one mechanism to help. The second risk is that investment income has gone up considerably as the Bank of Canada increased interest rates over the past 2 years. And so this review is to ensure we have enough buffer to help protect taxpayers against any shock if and when those interest rates begin to come down. So looking at our investment income area. Before we dive into the really details of it, just some key highlights, some background for you. So what do we mean when we talk about reserve funds? You hear this term largely around budget time because it's one of the key pieces of our financial framework and our financial plan that supports the budget process. Reserve funds are funds that have been set aside by council for specific purposes or as required by legislation. Those ones that are set aside because of external legislation are called obligatory. And you see on the right-hand side of the slide, those examples include the CCBF, Canada Community Building Fund, which a lot of us it was formerly called gas tax, and a lot of our minds still call it that as well. Development charges, building enterprise, and recreational land. So council can control how these funds are spent and used within projects, but within the rules given to us through the legislation. The other reserve fund type is called discretionary. The policy groups these into 4 classifications, and you would have seen this at budget time as well. Stabilization, which are like the rainy day funds for unforeseen events. Capital reserve funds to support our capital program. Corporate reserve funds to protect the city against certain corporate risks. And program-specific reserve funds are set aside to support specific programs at the city. Each of these types of reserve funds plays a critical part in the city's overall financial plan. So in reviewing our allocation of those potential year-end operating surpluses, we aim to balance the risk and funding needs across the operating program and capital program. Similar policies are in place at other municipalities. The proposed approach in front of you today means that first, in this kind of first stage marked on the slide, we would look to allocate 100% of the surplus until the minimum threshold is met on that stabilization reserve fund. That recognizes that we have a minimum requirement to support our financial risks. Once that minimum is met, in that kind of second stage of the diagram on the slide, we would allocate 50% to stabilization and 50% to capital. So that's when the balance in the stabilization reserve is between its min and max. We would find a balanced approach there. The stabilization reserve would continue to grow, and we would be continuing to set aside funds to help support that kind of rainy day fund, unforeseen events, but at the same time setting aside funds towards capital. The third stage is once that max target fund balance is met on the stabilization, then we would allocate all of the funding to capital, and that's under our existing framework as well, our current approach. So really the proposed changes in that step 2 spot, when the balance is between min and max, It's finding that balance of allocating half to stabilization and half to capital. As indicated in the report, if we are to apply this retroactively to 2023 year end, it would result in a transfer of $4.5 million to the Tax Capital Reserve Fund. And this is really just like a temporary landing spot for it, and those funds would be used as we move into the 2025 capital budget to help advance further works. At the same time, the Stabilization Reserve Fund balance will continue to remain in a stable and healthy position. It's at approximately its midpoint and midway between the min and max. The other piece of the risks that I alluded to was around our investment and the investment income and investment stabilization reserve fund. And so the transfers proposed would increase that balance in the investment stabilization reserve fund from its current $2 million max funding threshold to $2.5 million. And again, that's to protect taxpayers from the impacts of lower investment income that may come as the Bank of Canada lowers its interest rates. Other changes, as noted in the report and on the slide, are administrative in nature and better align with the province's financial reporting framework and generally support the transparency surrounding the city's reserve funds. Thank you for your time and consideration, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank you. I just wondered long-term, is our adjustments of this sort predictable, I guess is the word I'm looking for? Or is this sort of a one-off?
Sorry, I can't see the light there, so I was wondering if it had come off. Sorry, through the chair. So historically speaking, it's, we budget according to what we expect to use. So if we're looking forward, in an ideal world, we would have no surplus and no deficit. But historically speaking, we've had modest surpluses, as I noted, around the 1% mark, other than those 2 years where COVID was. So looking backwards, in the year-end report that was given to the Committee of the Whole back in March, our surpluses range from just under $1 million up to about $3 million this year.
So moving forward, you don't anticipate, well, I guess it could always happen, but it's,
yeah,
as long as we're running a surplus, then it's a good thing, I guess, that we're able to make these adjustments.
Yeah, through the chair, as I mentioned, the budget would plan for ideally no surplus, no deficit. Not everything always goes exactly according to plan. Historically speaking, we do see modest surpluses, so we would anticipate potentially that continuing if we're doing effective budgeting as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. Could I get a mover for the item? Moved by Councillor Ioannidis. Any comments? I'm not seeing any. I will just comment that, I think this is a great direction for us to go in. It kind of automates. I mean, I sometimes look at these policies too. I don't think of, us specifically on this council at this point in time. I think about the direction we're sending future councils as well, and it really sort of automates a level of fiscal discipline going forward. Otherwise, for new councillors that don't understand budgeting and the finances, it may not going through a process like this may make it appear like we have more, I would say, discretionary spending that could be spent when there is actual serious capital costs behind the scenes, like we heard in the previous report. So again, happy that staff brought this forward, and I'm happy to support. Those in favor? And that carries unanimously. And that concludes Finance and Corporate Services Committee. Can we go into special counsel early? That's next on the, no, we cannot.